There are now growing calls for a student loan bill of rights or some set of nationwide protections for the millions buckling under crushing debt.
There is now more than $1.7 trillion in student loan debt.
President Biden said he's willing to forgive $10,000 in student loans.
$1.8 trillion instead of going back to the federal government in debt repayment, instead being spent on homes.
I admit that the student loan problem is a huge issue.
There's a student loan debt crisis for a reason. There's a reason why other countries, this is not as big of an issue.
What's going on, Greg? This is YouTube. Wait a second. Okay, let me try that again. What's going on, guys? This is Greg. What's going on, YouTube Greg guys? Yeah, I think that's a winner. I think that one wins. According to educationdata.org, the current size of the U.S. student debt totals is $1.73 trillion. $1.73 trillion sounds like nothing. Like, it's such a big number that you really can't wrap your head around it, right? Like, you can picture maybe $1 million. Like, it makes sense to you. $1 billion, like, kind of getting out there, but it still makes a little bit of sense. But $1 trillion, like a $1 trillion, it's basically just a made-up number. But the size of the United States student debt totals right now is $1.73 trillion. And it really is important. That's a massive, massive issue. So to try and help visualize it, right? I always like those little animations they do where they'll show you like, oh, this is $100, this is $1,000, this is $1 million, and they like compare it next to like the size of a building or something like that, right? So here's how we can look at this, right? If you were to take $1 trillion and stack them on top of each other. Let's say they're $100 bills, right? You're stacking $100 bills on top of each other and you've got $1 trillion worth. If you were to do that, it would be as high as 67,866 miles. That's, so to help picture that even more, that is more than a quarter of the way between the Earth and the moon. So if you were to take $1 trillion in $100 bills, stack them on top of each other, it would go a quarter way to the moon. And that's just $1 trillion. If we want to think about it a slightly different way, right? The total equatorial circumference of the Earth, that is the distance from the equator to the equator when you go around it, the total distance is 25,000 miles. That means if you were to take this same stack of $1 trillion and $100 bills that you just stacked on top of each other, if you were to do that and you were to lay it on its side and wrap it around the Earth somehow, you could do that almost 3 times. Almost. Just shy of 3 times you could wrap around the Earth with $1 trillion. That's 1 trillion. The actual number that we're talking about is 1.73 trillion, which is basically 2 trillion. So you're talking about potentially wrapping the world in $100 bills 6 times, or getting more than halfway between the Earth and the moon. That's the size of the debt that we're dealing with. And I'm going to be honest with you, just going through those numbers, I'm a little bit depressed now. Like, I am. This is a major issue, and we really do need to be talking about this more. But let's bring this issue back to the individual. So the average person who graduates college has student debt of about $37,000. That is based on 2021 numbers. The average person has debt of about $37,000. Now, I personally have that in federal loans as well as an additional amount in private loans. So, yeah, me, I guess. And the last bit of info I want to give you just to help drive that point home, the average household has an interest rate of 5.8% on that debt. So let's make this whole thing make sense just a little bit more. Let's just bring it into real numbers. So let's take the average person, right? So they've got $37,000 in student debt, and the average household with 5.8% interest rate on that debt. So $37,000, the total amount that they borrowed, 5.8% interest rate. Now, if we're looking at after they graduate, they're paying the minimum payment on it, that would probably be something like $185. But let's pretend that they're paying $200 a month, right? It sounds good. $200 every single month towards that debt. But that's not actually what happens because we have that 5% interest rate. So that loan is actually increasing. The total amount owed is increasing every month at about $179, which leaves us with exactly $11 of that $200. $11 goes to the principal or the actual amount owed, with $179 going towards repaying the interest that was gained that month. So at that rate, given the average numbers, $37,000 worth of debt, 5.8% interest rate, and a $200 monthly payment, that person will get out of their debt. They'll repay the entire thing in just about 3,600 months. That's 280 years. Yeah. So let's look at the average college graduate in the United States. They're making about $50,000 a year. And of course, that is the average. Some are making far less, some are making far more, but that is the average across the 50 states. These people will have roughly $2,400 of their money every single year tied up in paying back these loans. And as we just established, at that rate, it would take them 280 years to pay it back. That's $2,400 tied up every single year for the entirety of their career that they are paying back on this debt. And by the end of it, they're probably still not even fully paid off. Now, of course, they do have the option to increase their payments, and that is what most people do. But the problem is the more you increase your payments, the more you need to sacrifice in order to make those payments every month. And so you get yourself in this situation where you either just accept that you have this debt and hold on to it for the rest of your life, not really worrying about anything other than the minimum, or you try to aggressively take it on. When you try to aggressively take it on, you are sacrificing other things. That means you are paying into your retirement account later. You're starting that up later. You are buying a home later. You're having kids later. You're maybe getting married later. So that's where you get a situation where you look at millennials, the group that I fall into, and many of us are not even having kids. And there are a number of reasons for it. But many people don't even want kids, or if they do, they're pushing it back until their mid-30s, partially, at least in part, because of how much debt they have and how little they're able to actually contribute towards building their future rather than paying back something that they chose to do in the past. So in my opinion, it is a crisis and it is something that needs to be addressed. A solution of some kind needs to be found. I'm not sure exactly what that solution is, but something needs to be figured out if we want to be able to move forward as a country. I think it comes down to a question of supply, demand, and ability. So in the beginning, there were no colleges, no universities, and basically everyone was dumb as f***. I'm obviously kidding. Please don't at me. My point is there were no colleges, no universities. There was no demand for a college or university. There was really no need for college or university or higher education, or for many people, even general education, because the economy was largely driven by agriculture and the booming industrial revolution, a revolution that focused on productivity and on people essentially acting like machines, doing one thing over and over and over again very well in large factories that are systematized and productized and put into place so that you didn't really have to be smart in order to have a great career. You didn't have to be educated in order to have a great career. So there was no demand for education, but there was a very large supply of land available for sale and a not so large supply of buyers for that land. So one of the things that these landowners did in order to improve the value of their land was start colleges. Now, they didn't actually care about college as an educational institution. They just cared about it improving the value of their land and the appeal of their land so that they could get people to come in and buy that land. And so they started these colleges, put them in control of the church, and brought in all of the potential buyers for that land. It started as a way to increase profits from land, which is just about the most American thing I've ever heard, quite honestly. Like, seriously, I just love this idea that all of these landowners in the 19th century were sitting there like, ooh, how do we bring in the hipsters? And so they started a college on their the idea of a 19th century hipster just honestly cracked me up. But the point is, they wanted to sell their land. They needed to increase the value, so they started colleges. And that's obviously not the complete origin story, but that is a big factor that I think many of us don't know. So over time, this increased the supply of colleges. If we go back to that supply-demand model, this increased the supply of colleges, but there was still no demand. Part of this is because the product wasn't good. Like, colleges didn't actually do anything that valuable. There was no real education happening. There was no standard across these colleges. And so what you got was just sort of like a mishmash system of schools taught by different groups, and those different groups had different standards. And so you're learning different things based on where you're going. There's no standardized system that would then allow them to have any kind of clout as far as getting employment or any real value added to it. So you had all these colleges that didn't really have a great product. You didn't have anybody who wanted to go because there was no need to. And it creates this like lopsided supply-demand curve. Now, all of this changed with the introduction of what's called the German Research University. And the idea behind this was that the university could be a central place for high-level, cutting-edge research and for educating high-level elites on really, really complicated issues. And so you started seeing essentially improvements in the product of college, what it was, what you would get for it. And that built some demand among a very specific group of people. It was essentially the niching down of college. It was, we're going to be this place for this very specific group who can afford to spend on this kind of thing. And that built a little bit of demand and started the very, very foundation level work that led to the system that we have now. So what this did, this German Research University model, is it added status around the idea of attending college. It tied the quality of the education you had with how much money you had, because only rich people could afford to go to it. And also the education that they were teaching there would really only appeal to rich people. There was no real world application being taught for the most part. And so if you were wealthy, it became a status symbol to attend college or university. But as you can imagine, this did nothing for the lower class, the plebeians like you and I, who aren't wealthy by any means. In fact, we're the ones in debt. Yay. Everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. So let's fast forward to World War II here. See, during World War II, colleges were completely revamped. Part of this is because the draft exposed massive, massive discrepancies between the average person's education level. Normal people didn't have the same level of reading comprehension as everyone else. And so many people weren't able to be drafted because they just didn't hit the education requirement. And that put a national level focus on the country's education system. Another major factor was that the war required very expensive research, which led to the United States government looking to universities and colleges as a source of that research and starting to fund some of that research. That increased the revenue that colleges brought in and also increased the status of those colleges, allowing them to use that status as additional marketing for attracting new students. Additionally, in 1946, the automotive industry pioneered starting to use automation to create their vehicles, which cut down drastically the labor requirements, which meant less jobs for regular uneducated people. And that started the shift. That plus the increased focus from the government, plus the additional marketing from the universities themselves, plus the shift in culture in general and the advancements in technology and more of a switch away from labor and towards sort of like a knowledge economy, which is what we're kind of living in now. All of that led to massive, massive increases in the demand side for college. So you already had a major supply side, right? We already knew that. They started as a way to sell land. Now we're finally catching up and getting massive increases in the demand side. And then the US government made their next move, which kind of tilted the scales a little bit. And funny enough, this move was in response to being beaten. So the Russians launched the first artificial Earth satellite called Sputnik. And the US was kind of like, damn, we're behind, dog. We got to catch up. And so they passed the National Defense Education Act. And there was a lot of things that this act did, but one major part, was it increased the availability of funding for universities. It also created a precedent and legitimized funding universities and their research. And finally, it made large amounts of money available for regular people to attend universities. This started the college funding system that we know today. And so not only do you have a large amount of supply, you also now have a large amount of demand and a large amount of money for regular people to be able to attend. So you have a really good system in place that shifts the focus towards education being a priority in order to build a better life, which was a lot of what the marketing around education was. Not to mention the shift in employers away from labor-based jobs to knowledge-based jobs and skill-based jobs, which would utilize education as a way to judge whether or not an applicant was worth the time. So now this is where we get into a little bit of speculation, because And I have to remind you, I'm not an economist. I'm not whatever degrees would be in charge of studying this. But in my reading, there seems to be two groups of thought as to what happens next. Because between the beginning of the Cold War era and President Reagan entering office, there were a lot more acts passed to make additional funding available for people to attend college. Essentially, there was just money available everywhere, not to mention the cost of college hadn't actually increased all that much because it was just sort of coming through this period of time where there was zero demand to begin with. So you have this perfect situation of money coming in, colleges being available and cheap, and people needing that as a way to move their life forward. Then Ronald Reagan enters office, and one of his major focuses was to cut funding to universities, which included things like Pell Grants and those federal student loans. And this is where the speculation comes in, because you have two sides arguing. Some people, like Professor Devin Fergus, believe that those cuts led to the government being unable to keep up with the rising costs of college. His argument is essentially that college prices were going to increase anyway because now there's an increase in demand. And quite honestly, there's more demand than there is supply of high quality colleges. And since we reduced funding, that created an inability to keep up with how much needed to be available for students. Then you have others like Richard Vedder, who claim that college costs rose because money was being made available. So essentially, because these loans were there, colleges felt that they could increase their prices because the government would pick up the bill, essentially. They were guaranteed to make whatever amount they charged, and so they're going to increase prices. My personal opinion is a little bit different. I think what happened is you had this perfect storm. there was no demand for college whatsoever. You had a very large supply. The product then improved and demand started increasing among a very specific group of people who had money to pay for that type of product. Then the government decided that this was an important thing and they were going to fund it and make it available. That kicked off this era where we have money coming in at low interest rates or no interest whatsoever, coming in, allowing people who are lower class, lower income to utilize college as a tool to advance. We also have a situation where automation switches the focus of the economy and the labor force away from these manual labor jobs towards something that requires a higher level of education. And you have the marketing around college as the way forward. If you want to improve your life, if your kids want to improve their lives, if you want them to be better off than you were, then they have to go to college. And we get years and years and years of this message being baked into the culture of the United States. Then the funding dries up, and it has never really returned back to the levels that it should be at. But the funding dries up for a number of reasons. Reagan is a part of it, 2008 is a part of it, and there were various things in between that reduced funding available for students. But at the end of the day, government funding started to dry up, and I believe that that created a hole. I believe that essentially that allowed private organizations to come in, be the lenders, because now college is a requirement. Employers require a degree. People, if they want to move forward in life, feel as though they should be going to college. And so you get a situation where there is enormous demand, but not enough ability. And because the federal funding has been reduced, less people are getting it, you get people coming in who have money sitting around, see the opportunity, and are able, because it's a private transaction, to charge higher interest rates and have significantly less regulation on them. Now, there are a lot of other factors to consider here. The truth is the vast majority of the outstanding, that 1.73 trillion, the outstanding debt, the vast majority of that, something like 92%, are federal loans. Only 8% is held by a private company like a Navient. So it's not like the private industry has actually caused that much damage. I think a big part of the problem is that the interest rates within the private sector are so high that it makes repaying those federal loans significantly harder. And you end up prioritizing those private loans simply because they have that higher interest rate. So that's the history of it. There are, of course, a lot of other factors. There are plenty of things I skipped over for time, but I do think it's important to go through and recognize how we got to this point. So I've, of course, linked to all of the resources I read through. There's something like 25, 27 different sources in the description of this episode. I encourage you to go through at least a few of them and see what maybe you didn't know about this situation. But what I want to do now is look at what's next, because I do think this is a problem, and it's one that is going to be solved one way or another. And it really just comes down to how long does it take and what the solution looks like and where we as a country are as a result of that solution. Right now, the way I see it, we are the Titanic heading straight for the iceberg. And we, for whatever reason, are choosing not to turn around. So that's kind of the vibe that I'm getting from the state of this situation. Because the truth is, the need for college or university has only increased since the time of Reagan, since the 90s, since the early 2000s, heck, even since the early 2010s. The need for college, the value of college has increased dramatically. More and more companies are having additional requirements in order to land even an entry-level position. And so you end up with a situation where the demand is even higher and the supply really isn't changing all that much. And another major thing is that the amount you can earn for going to college hasn't actually increased all that much. It has not kept pace with the cost of attending university. And so you end up with people going to college in order to land a job, but never quite making enough, at least for the first 5-10 years, to be able to actually pay that debt back. So ultimately, this keeps more of us in debt longer than maybe we'd like to be. And that does lead to people starting things later than they would have even just one generation ago. People are getting married later, buying homes later. Some people will never be able to afford a home, especially when you look at the specifics of like the housing market and the issues there, which I might do another video on. Let me know if you want that. Drop a comment below. But ultimately, people are doing things later because they're choosing to aggressively tackle that debt and get out of it. And I've said this before, I'm not an economist, but I can't help but wonder what effect this is going to have in 20 or 50 years. What effect is people starting things later off going to have on the economy, on individuals' quality of life, on the next generation where they're starting out in their quality of life? Is the next generation going to be in even more debt simply because their parents were never able to pay off their debt? And so the next generation, by definition, will also have to take on debt. Are we essentially creating a situation where every generation is forced into debt of some kind because the previous generation was never able to pay off the debt that they already had? I don't know the answer to that, but it can become a really scary thing when you stop and try to really look at it. Not to mention, how is this going to put us in comparison to other countries who maybe have a better system? You look at a country like Australia, where in many cases you can attend uni, and as long as you work within the country for some period of time afterwards, your debt is completely forgiven. How is that going to affect their ability to build their individual quality of life? And of course, as a result, the quality of their country over the next 10, 20, 50 years versus a country where the vast majority of people have some kind of debt and they're stuck in that for the rest of their life, pushing off other decisions until later as a result. I'm not sure the answers to it, but these are really important questions that do need to find some kind of solution. But thankfully, it's not all bad news, because there already are starting to be some changes. The cost of colleges increasing has the counter effect of reducing the total number of people willing to pay that cost. And so there is starting to become more and more questioning of whether or not college is even worth it for certain types of careers. There are also starting to be more and more companies who, rather than requiring a formal college degree, might allow people to have specific, essentially trade education. So going through like coding boot camps, or going through a specific program online that they've sort of approved as their internal requirements. Because at the end of the day, all a company really wants a degree for is some kind of third-party proof that you're capable of doing the work. They essentially just want to reduce risk when it comes to that. And so it raises the question, is a college degree actually required, or is there some other form of education that can allow you to still hold that role, still be valuable to the company, and still reduce the risk? So these questions are starting to be asked, especially on the back of the pandemic that we're still going through, as people have been moving indoors and staying inside and not necessarily attending class in the same way that they always have, switching to online education, deferring a year. Companies are starting to ask these questions in order to have access to the future labor pool who is starting to attend college a little bit less than previous labor pools. The student debt crisis is a major problem. It's something that is not going to just disappear overnight. And no matter what happens, it does need to be considered. There have been more pushes from the population and politicians to forgive some of that debt, to essentially wipe the slate clean. And I'm not really sure where that's going to end up. Probably, if I'm being honest, this isn't going to be an issue that's solved for my generation, for the generation that is probably suffering the most with that debt. But at the very least, I hope that generations from now, in some not so distant future, historians look back on this time and say that it was a dark era of education. Because while there is value in education, while there is value in going to school and learning from experts that have published in their space and are actively working in their space and can guide you, while there's value in meeting people and making connections and having these 4 years to figure out where you want to go and how to be a person, an adult, while there's value in that, the cost is getting far too high and the availability of funds is significantly lower than it should be. So something needs to be done, and hopefully we'll get there. Leave a comment down below, and I'm going to be in the comments responding to as many people as I can. So leave a comment and let's chat there.